Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. And we are reading Treasures of the Snow by Patricia St. John with permission of Moody Publishing Company. And we are reading Chapter 23, Danny Meets the Doctor. Monsieur Benet met the mule train himself and with his own mule sled and drove Monsieur Gavette and Lucien up to the chalet. All the villagers came to their front door to see the famous doctor pass, as everyone had heard the story. They were talking about Lucien as if he were a great hero for being so brave to cross the pass as he did. Monsieur Benet sat silently in his driver's seat, not knowing what to think about it all. It was rather a responsibility having such a famous man on that sled. He had only hoped that the mule, who was very frisky that day, wouldn't tip the sleigh over the edge on one of the bends, which often happened. He was worried about the money, too. Of course, he would give every penny he had to see Danny cured, but he didn't have very many pennies. And what if they weren't enough? Perhaps this very famous doctor would accept a young bull as a way of payment. Fortunately, they reached the chalet without any adventures or upsets, and Monsieur Benet helped the doctor get down and then lifted poor Lucien in his strong arms and carried him up the steps into the front door, where he laid him on the couch. He, too, was pleased to see Lucien, for he had spent a long, weary night searching for him in the drifts. Grandmother, Annette, and Danny looked rather odd, as though they were about to have their photo taken. They were all dressed in their very best clothes, sitting in a stiff little group on the edge of the best chairs. They looked as though they had been sitting there expecting the very famous doctor for a long time. And when he came in, Annette and Danny looked at Grandmother and stood up politely. Danny was not at all pleased. He had thought that a very famous man would be dressed in a red robe like a governor who made William Tell shoot the apple off of his son's head in Annette's Swiss history book. This stranger who came in behind Papa didn't look very special at all. The doctor sat on a chair not very far away as possible from the group, and smiled at them. He had a nice broad smile, and Danny forgot his disappointment and smiled back. Monsieur Javette put his hand in his pocket and took out a sweet and held it out. "Would you like a sweet, Danny?" he asked. Danny grinned happily and nodded his head hard. "Come and fetch it then," said Monsieur Javette, and Danny hopped delightfully across the room while the doctor watched him very closely. When the child reached him, he lifted him onto his knee and put the sweet into his mouth. He rather liked this family, especially the chuckling, friendly, blue-eyed little boy who sat noisily sucking a sweet on his lap. He noticed, too, that there was no mother, and wondered whether it was the old woman or the little girl who kept the chalet looking so neat and tidy. "Does your leg hurt?" asked Monsieur Javette. "No," answered Danny. "No, monsieur," corrected Grandmother. "Monsieur," added Danny. "Only sometimes when I walk without my crutches. My crutches have got bear heads on them. Would you like to see them?" "Very much indeed," said Mr. Javette, and as Danny hopped over to fetch them, he again watched him very closely. "I can do enormous great hops on my crutches," announced Danny proudly. "Would you like to see me?" "Very much indeed," answered the doctor again. "Be careful of the chairs, Danny," said Grandmother quickly, for she had forbidden Danny to do enormous great hops in the house. Annette quickly picked up the two kittens, as she wasn't sure where Danny would land. The hop was a huge success, and the doctor clapped his hands. "Well done," he cried. "That was exactly like a kangaroo I once saw in the zoo. Now put down your crutches and walk to me without them." Danny limped toward him, smiling but dragging his lame leg rather pitifully. Monsieur Javette smiled back, lifted the little boy very gently onto his knee again, and gave him another sweet. Grandmother, who had been watching very closely, turned to Annette. "Annette," she said, "put the kettle on and make a pot of tea and bring out the biscuit tin." While Annette was getting the tea, Monsieur Javette laid Danny flat on the table and twisted and turned his leg about for a long time. In fact, when he finished the tea was ready, and Grandmother invited him to sit down and drink with them, he seemed to be thinking hard. "Well," said Grandmother at last, rather sharply, "can you do anything for him?" Every eye in the room was fixed on him as he waited for the answer, except for Danny, whose eyes were fixed on the biscuits because they had forgotten to pass him one, and Grandmother would be cross if she got up and helped himself. They were special bricklet biscuits, thin, crisp, golden, and delicious, and Grandmother made them once a month on a special grill. Monsieur Javette did not answer at once. He turned to Danny instead. "Danny," he said, would you like to be able to run about like other little boys?" Danny hesitated. He was not quite sure. He was the only boy in the village who had bear crutches, and it made him a very special person. And then he remembered that spring was coming, and unless he could run about, he would not be able to chase the baby goats in the meadows that he had done last year. Chasing baby goats was such good fun. So he said, "Yes, thank you, I would. And please, Grandmother, may I have a bricklet biscuit?" No one answered. Lucy and Annette were sitting with their cups held in midair, both rather pale. Everyone was still staring at Mr. Javette. "Danny," said the doctor suddenly, "where's that fine cat gone?" "To the woodshed," said Danny. "Would you like to see her? She's got 3 kittens." "Yes, please," answered Monsieur Javette, and Danny limped off to find Claus, helping himself to 2 bricklet biscuits as he passed the table, but no one seemed to notice. As soon as the door had closed on Danny, Monsieur Javette turned to Papa. "I think I may be able to help you," he said, leaning forward and speaking very earnestly, "although I can't tell for certain until I've seen the X-ray of it. I think the bone was never set properly and is joined up wrongly, but I could break it again and pull it out straight. It would mean an operation and a long stay in the hospital. Would you be willing to let him come?" Papa rubbed his hands together miserably and looked hopelessly, first at Grandmother, then Annette. He had no experience with operations, and the words sounded horrible. Besides, he had been told that operations were expensive, and he wouldn't be able to pay. "How much would it cost?" he asked at last, scratching his head. "Wouldn't cost you anything," replied Monsieur Javette. "Lucien has paid for it himself. In any case, I can't explain now, because Danny will be back, and we must decide before he comes. Will you let me take him?" "Yes," replied Grandmother, who hadn't been asked. "When?" inquired Annette. "Tomorrow morning," replied Monsieur Javette. "I shall be catching the early train and can take Danny with me." Where am I going on the train?" asked a clear voice. Danny had come in quietly through the back door, and no one had noticed him. Now he stood at Monsieur Javette's elbow with an armful of kittens, looking pleased. He had only been on the train once in his whole life, just for 10 minutes, and he'd never forgotten it. No one answered. They were still staring at Mr. Javette. "Where, Grandmother?" asked Danny again. The doctor turned to Danny. "Danny," he said, "you're coming with me down to the lake, and you're going to stay with me for a while. I'm going to make your leg better. Would you like that?" Danny looked as if he wasn't too sure about it. "And Annette?" he asked firmly. And Grandmother and Papa and Claus and the kittens?" "Yes, monsieur, we shall all like it very much." "Oh, no, Danny," cried Annette. "We can't all go. You've got to be good and go by yourself. Monsieur Javette will look after you, and you'll soon come back." She was nearly crying herself. The effect of these words were terrible. Danny flung himself, kittens and all, into Annette's arms and burst into tears, making the most deafening noise. Never had they heard such a row. Annette hugged and kissed him, and Grandmother tried to soothe him, and Papa pressed handfuls of biscuits into his clenched fist, but nothing helped. The family looked at each other helplessly. Monsieur Javette knew he had to think of something very quickly. He turned to Grandmother. "Does this little girl know anything about looking after children?" he shouted above the din. "She brought up this one," shouted back Grandmother. "You had better send her with her little brother then," yelled Monsieur Javette. "She can help my wife." "Danny," shouted Annette, shaking him to make him listen. "I'm coming too." Danny stopped at once, giving 3 hiccups, and smiled. Mr. Javette did not smile back. He picked up the little boy and spoke to him seriously. "I'm afraid you are very spoiled, Danny," he said. "When you come to my hospital, you will have to do what you are told without any fuss or screaming." He put Danny down. "I'm going to take Lucien home if you can lend me a sled," he said, "so I will say goodbye for now. The 2 children will meet me on the platform at 8:30 tomorrow morning with all they need for the next 2 or 3 months. Annette shall help my wife in the mornings and go to evening classes for her schooling. In the afternoon she will be free to be with her little brother." Papa shook his hand dumbly and wiped his brow. Things were moving so fast that he felt he had been left behind. But he was beginning to understand that for 2 months, starting tomorrow, he had to live without Annette and Danny in a silent, tidy chalet. He went stumbling over to the cowshed to milk and try to think things out. Grandmother said goodbye at the door and held the doctor's hand for a moment. "You are a good man," she said suddenly. "God will reward you." Mr. Javette looked at the brave old woman in front of him. He saw her with her 2 happy, healthy grandchildren behind her and the clean, peaceful home of which she was a guardian angel. He knew she was strengthened by love and courage and realized that she was a very special person. "You too," he replied, "are a good, unselfish woman, and will most certainly find your reward." Monsieur Javette pulled Lucien to his own chalet on a borrowed sled and carried him to his mother. She pretended to be very angry with him. "You naughty boy, Lucien," she cried, "going off like that and giving us all such a dreadful fright. How could you have done such a thing? You deserve a beating." She took him almost roughly from Monsieur Javette's arms and helped him up the stairs and put him to bed herself. Then she came back and sat down on the table, flung her black apron over her face, and began to cry. "You've a very brave son, madame," said Monsieur Javette. "He's a very naughty boy," snapped madame, and because she was so terribly proud of him and so glad to see him safe, she began to cry worse than before. She and Marie had baked a big batch of Lucien's favorite cakes all morning, and the house was full of a good smell. They invited Monsieur Javette to sit and eat with them, but he refused because he still had something important to do, and time was getting on. "I believe," he began rather sharply, "that Lucien knows some old man around here. Can you tell me where he lives?" "An old man?" repeated Marie. "Oh, yes, that would be the old man up in the mountain who teaches Lucien wood carving. They spend hours together. Although what Lucien sees in him, goodness knows, most people say he's crazy." "Can you tell me the way to his house?" asked Monsieur Javette. "Why, yes," replied Marie, surprised. "It's straight up towards the forest, but I shouldn't go up there if I were you, sir. The path would be bad after all this snow." "I have business with him," replied Mr. Javette. "Perhaps you will point out the path to me from the door. On the way down I will come in and say goodbye to Lucien." Monsieur Javette thought how beautiful the forest looked as he toiled up the track that late afternoon. What it must be like, he thought, to be that old man and live alone among all that silence and peace, sharing the secrets of the forest. He began to look forward to meeting him and found his heart was beating faster than usual. As he left the forest, he could see the hut sitting halfway up the meadow, with snow piled high against its wall. The old man had dug a little path as far as the trees, almost as though he were expecting a visitor, thought Monsieur Javette, picking his way along the way. He knocked softly on the door and went in without waiting for a reply. The old man sat hunched over his stove, whittling wood and smoking his pipe. A goat and a cat sat on each side of him for company. Mr. Javette sat on the chair on the other side of the stove. "Well," said the old man, still not looking up, "did you get there safely, Lucien?" "It's not Lucien," replied Monsieur Javette softly, and the old man jumped and looked up. They sat staring at each other as though they had seen a ghost, and yet certainly as though the ghost might possibly be real after all. "I have come to give you back your money," said Monsieur Javette at last. "I don't want money to help that child. Under the circumstances, I will do it for free, if it can be done." "That boy broke his promise," growled the old man, and he leaned his chin on the stick and stared and stared and stared. "He did not break his promise," replied Monsieur Javette. "He told me nothing except that it was given him by an old man that said it was a payment of a debt. But I do not accept large sums of money from peasant boys without making sure they were come by honestly. I had no difficulty in finding out from other people who you were and where you lived." There was another long, long silence. "Is that all you have to say?" said the old man at last. His voice sounded suddenly old and weary and hopeless. Monsieur Javette got up quickly and knelt down beside the bowed figure of the old man. "Need we pretend any more?" he asked. "Surely we both know quite sure of each other. I've come to take you home, Father, and to tell you how much we've missed you and wanted you." Tomorrow will be chapter 24. Jesus' love makes all the difference. I love you, I'm praying for you, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.